Today is February 22, 2014. We're going to take a look at, we're going to go way back. We're going to go back 276 years to 1737. And we're going to take a look at the philosophy of David Hume, the empiricist, because we have found out that he has served to inspire much of the postmodern thought today. And so in our studies of going back to find the substrate for all postmodern thinking, we've been led to David Hume, and specifically to his treatise entitled A Treatise on Human Nature. He actually did write that in France, which is kind of ironic because that's where the postmodern movement was born. But he wrote it at a college in France. He wrote it during a 3-year period of time from 1734 to 1737. And in 1737, he was only 27 years old, but he had already had 11 years of intensive philosophical training because he began his philosophical studies at the age of 16. So not your typical 27-year-old by any means. But he did put together his treatise on human nature. It was not received well because it was considered too obscure, too abstract, too difficult to understand. And really only after we've reached this postmodern period and have the benefit of the additional years of learning that now these writers from France and Germany go back and they look at David Hume and they are inspired by his psychological approach to philosophy, which postmoderns also adapt. And in addition to the psychological approach to the self, he coupled that with a strictly empiricist view. So he starts with the sensate side of existence, which is what the postmoderns also emphasize. And so David Hume becomes a inspirational figure for the emergence of thought in the 21st century, and is finally understood in the proper way. His treatise is taken up and now it's considered a masterpiece. But we will be able to look at it in the same way that we look at postmodern thinking, because Hume was one of the individuals. Obviously there was Bouffray and many others, but Hume is one of the foundational thinkers for postmodern thought. So we will use the psychological structure. We won't vary from that. But we'll look at his offerings, which really did inspire many of the concepts, and you will discover that as we go along. We will end up finding out that really many of the ideas that postmoderns have adopted, including one of my favorites, Jean-Luc Nancy, were picked up from David Hume. You know, from our vantage point of 2014, we're looking at 276 years ago. So, you know, we're looking at an 18th century work that all of a sudden now applies to 21st century thinking in a profound way. So we never lose sight of the history of philosophy, evidently. I mean, here we are. I never had ever considered empiricism in such an overwhelmingly serious way until now that I've taken up postmodernism. Now I look at Hume and I'm really impressed with this treatise, with the maturity of it, and what he has to offer. I think it's going to be an interesting look for how we already know postmodern thought is shaped, and so we can really see how this particular system, it forms a substrate. So we're going to start in the unconscious, just like we normally do, and we're going to move up from the unconscious. We're going to pass through that axis threshold, and then we're going to swing over into the cognitive side of working toward the cognitive rational system. And then Hume also did formulate that idea of counterblow and that cyclical passing back into the unconscious, and the encounter with pure otherness that was initiated in his thinking. And so he does propose that once we reach that cognitive level of reason, the inertia of that movement pulls us right back into the unconscious. And we start the cycle over again and again. So it is a dialectical system. It's a dialectical system deeply rooted in sensual impressions, and then they will swing over to cognitive ideas. So the dialectic is between impressions and ideas, sensate impressions and rational ideas. And they will pivot on that axis threshold, that fulcrum of the axis self. And we will take a look at that in detail also. So we're going to try to do it fairly quickly. Like I said, we're already familiar with the structure, so we don't have to give a lot of extra time to that. We should be able to get it done fairly quickly. So we're going to start with the unconscious, and we're going to start with the 3 steps of the unconscious, which is pretty much the format that's been adopted by everybody. But Hume initiated that. The 3 steps in the unconscious consist of simple impressions, reflection impressions, and complex impressions. Now, simple impressions are just very basically all of our sensate impressions, which is going to be, taste, touch, vision, sound. All of our sensate impressions are considered simple impressions that have not had any additional reflection applied to them. They just exist as feeling percepts that are encoded in our mechanical memory. In other words, we just have a sensate feeling percept of a sensual intuition, and it's nothing more than that. It's just a simple sensate impression. But one thing that Hume does, which Husserl picked this up. Remember when Husserl talked about the trace that influences our sensate impressions? Well, Hume initiated that idea way back in 1737 because he talks about the fact that we do have an influential sphere, which he calls a gentle force, that does confront us when we consider these simple impressions. And that force is from the fact that he presumes, just like Hegel presumed, that the system has already at least run one time. So we already have one return out of the cognitive area, and that return, which Hegel called counterblow, that is the return of the complex ideas as a system, as a relational system of concepts, does return back into the unconscious, and it lingers there as kind of a qualifying, what Hume calls a qualifying gentle force of influence that therefore forces us into kind of an unconscious reflection. So it's kind of a proto-reflection. It's not true cognitive reflection, but there is an unconscious kind of a proto-reflection type activity of the mind, even in this intuitive impression level. And he said that this is based on resemblance and substance. And resemblance is where we apply what he calls 7 different concepts of resemblance that we'll go over to the simple impressions in order to grow a grouping of feeling percepts, which will thereby give us our feeling percept body of content. We'll end up with that body of percepts that are going to be gained by working through association and comparative reflection. We'll be able to put together a body of percepts into our mechanical memory. Now, additionally, we do reflection concerning substance, and here we apply the derived substance or the derived form as contributed by the counterblow of that previous complex idea system that has returned into the unconscious and lingers there to kind of influence us. That provides kind of a proto-form that is lingering already in every one of our unique encounters. We still have that lingering past conceptualization. That supplies substance. So we get both form and content are addressed in this proto-reflection state. But Hume says that takes place because that's the mediation from simple impressions to complex impressions. And complex impressions are very simply taking the feeling percepts and grouping them into a form-structured thought picture. It's not going to be a conceptual model. That's going to come later on the cognitive side. But rather than a conceptual model, there will be a model, but it's going to be a model of images. It's going to be a picture model, but it's going to include this proto-reflexive work. So it's going to be a what we've discussed before. It's going to be that emotive thought picture, that thought picture of the unconscious that groups together all of these feeling percepts according to a proto-reflexive work through resemblance and substance, which is contributed from that lingering form content that has returned from the system already running once. So that takes us into the complex impressions. That's the third block here on the unconscious side. And Hume says that we get involved in enchaining. We've heard that many times. John Luke Nancy loves that term, enchaining. That came from Hume. When we enchain together the finite number of feeling percepts, or what he calls intuitive points. It also involves abstraction. We abstract a more generalized thought picture because we further interpret meaning out of these feeling percepts, Hume says, by running them through the categories of space and time. So he says that we end up with the abstract concepts of space and time. They help us to, in fact, he even says that they cause the feeling percepts to self-evolve or to self-resolve into an ordered thought picture on their own. But when he says that, he implies that subjectivity is really at work in that proto-reflexive work. But there is a resolving within the context of space and time of a pre-linguistic thought picture of an image-type quality, not concepts, but an image-type thought picture, which gives us a more comprehensive view of our situation that wants to rise to a more meaningful event. But that picture, that thought picture, is going to be one that has been influenced by the system already running once. It's going to be influenced by that counterblow of the previous complex idea system that is already encoded in the mind. Even at the unconscious level, it even lingers there. So it has a lingering presence in the unconscious and in consciousness both, and it lingers there to influence the unconscious reflexive work, and we end up with that thought picture. So that gives us our three blocks in the unconscious of simple impressions, reflection impressions through resemblance and substance because of the influence of the counterblow of return, then the third block of complex impressions forming a thought picture through enchaining and abstraction and the organizational work of imagination. And for Hume, it's important to understand that the space of the mind that makes up imagination is a space that cuts right through the axis point. So the imagination bleeds into the unconscious, and the imagination bleeds into consciousness. It's not strictly on the unconscious side like it is in a lot of postmodern models. For Hume, the imagination is on both sides, the unconscious and the consciousness side of the mind. It's teetering right on the access point. So the imagination forms this thought picture, and then, like we've learned from Husserl and from Heidegger and from Hegel too, the big three, we're going to copy that to the access threshold in order to get ready to do the work for what Hume calls the work on ideas. It's the cognitive work, but for Hume, the dialectic is between impression and idea. Sensual impression and rational idea. So we copy this thought picture to the access threshold of the mind, and he calls this copying a copying to the access mind as the cell of idea traces. Now, I've always wondered where that concept trace came from, and now I know it came from Hume. And that is used by every single postmodern thinker. They always talk about the trace that is visible in the situation, the trace of the other. Well, that trace, according to Hume, is that signaling of a deeper meaning for the image in the thought picture that wants to become idea. So we copy the thought picture, it's copied to the access mind as a unifying soma. So now instead of thought picture, we take up the concept of the Greek term soma, or body. We have a body of traces that kind of take on a signification type quality that want to emerge to ideas. And so it's a body of traces, and the feeling percepts fall into their corresponding trace of meaning, and that creates the proto-idea. And even the space, the distance between objects, the space between the percepts, is considered part of the soma. So the soma is the entire encompassing unity, including the relational space. So Hume says it's the objects or the percepts, it's the structure, and it's the relational linkage. The relational enchaining is part of the soma substance. So even space has true soma substance. But that's copied into a cell of idea traces, and therefore we're ready to pivot through the axis of the mind over into the cognitive side and get busy on forming the idea, the complex idea system, instead of the impression percept thought picture. So we're going to move on to developing this complex idea system. So the fundamental triad that sits at the access point consists of 1, the traces of impressions. 2, he's going to tell us in this very next step, is going to be the work of inference, that we infer meaning from these traces. And then that will end to the third block of the triad as the ideas as system, as rational system. So that mediating area that gets involved in the work of inference is what Hume calls the realm of belief. So if you wanted the big triad to put together, for Hume it would be impression 1, belief 2, idea 3. If we just want the big triad, it would be impression 1, belief 2, and idea 3. Now, belief is the area where we, again at the access threshold, but on the cognitive side, where we create the ideas of force. Ideas, these trace proto-ideas are given emotive force that empowers them for deeper meaning. So again, it's another copying, but it's a copying into the cognitive workspace, which Hegel called the realm of ideation. And that's what it is here for Hume. He doesn't give it that term, but it is this workspace of the ideal. And All ideas are associated with the present trace impressions that we have just copied. There's no additional new material that's given to this trace proto-idea. It speaks for itself. We do transition here to the linguistic model. We start using true propositions and true concepts. And amplitude is applied here. Emotive force is added to the idea as it is created. So we take the trace percept, the percept coupled with its trace of deeper meaning, we apply an emotive amplitude of force to it, and that creates a conceptual idea. And all of this is evolves through what he calls custom. We develop customary ways of associating concepts just through the practical, repetitive work and memory. We keep, through every experience we have in the sensate world, we keep filing these experiences in our mechanical memory. We can refer to that, and we can do associative work to develop a true model of linguistic concepts now that are simple ideas. So there's no real syntactical structure here yet, but we have formed a true lexical content. A true linguistic lexical content is the first block on the cognitive side, and we form this cognitive lexical content in this workspace called belief. The workspace of belief, which applies the emotive force of deeper meaning to the traces of meaning to drive them into the depth of becoming conceptual ideas. So just like we had in the unconscious side, we had that proto-reflexive work that applied resemblance and substance. On the cognitive side, Hume says we have an additional mediating block. It'd be block 2 for this side, but instead of calling it a proto-reflection, it's the block of annexation and extension. Annexation and extension. And basically it involves a recollection of the imaginative instances of habits, the habitual recalling of feeling percepts that we have stored in mechanical memory, and that kind of gives us a customary way or habitual way of considering them. And we develop, we'd see how they've developed and through belief into true significations now, where they have a kind of conceptual naming, a linguistic name. But they are singular terms. They are not complex. They are singular only. And the singular terms are abbreviations of a fragmented content. Remember, this is what others talk about, but it came from Hume. A sign is an abbreviation of subsigns. And what Hume says here is this is where we form that subsign content. We take other experiential feeling percepts, and we keep annexing them, or adding them to the fundamental singular term concept, and it's a continual annexation. We store in mechanical memory, then we retrieve it, and we add to it, we retrieve, and we add to it, and we continue to build signification. But it remains abbreviated under the singular conceptual linguistic term. So we end up with annexed primary ideas, which he says extends signification. So this block is about extending or deepening the meaning of those primary concepts that we formed in belief. So belief becomes deeper conviction, deeper signification. And so the 4 steps really in this mediation area are recollection of the feeling percepts, annexation under an abbreviated sign, extension of the abbreviated sign to include all of its subsigns, and then obviously a revision of the singular concept. So this second block helps us to kind of refine our lexical content, our body of lexical concepts stored in mechanical memory. We kind of fine-tune all of those singular ideas. We kind of get them fine-tuned to perfection through this continual association and annexation. So annexation after annexation continues to build an extended sign with that abbreviates subsigns, and it leads to an eventual, more precise revision of the singular simple idea. So now we've got this body of lexical content in the Wittgenstein sense, and as Wittgenstein would say, well, now it's time to add a syntax to that and to structurally organize your lexical content. And that's called system, obviously. And for Hume, that is what he calls complex ideas. We move from the singular to the complex ideas as system. So it is for Hume, he says it is anticipatory in nature. It is uses the methodology of resemblance, of applying custom of impressions, 2, the logic of causality, and 3, the process of educating the self through the various number of times that we keep running this dialectical cycle. So that overall triad, like I mentioned, I'll mention it again, but Hume mentions it here in this third block. So the overall triad to form system is impressions, 1, belief, 2, idea, 3. Or you could say it another way, the complex impressions as a thought picture, the simple ideas of emotive force and belief to form a lexical content, and then 3, the complex of ideas developed as system. That's your overall triad. So he closes out by talking about the mediation of belief again. He says there are 4 aspects of this mediation of belief that kind of runs the entire system. Number 1, emotive force. And we have to realize, he says, that even when we return back into the unconscious encounter blow, we will always return not directly back into unconscious, but we will pass through the belief and emotive force again. And so it helps to actually to return to the unconscious with a little bit of emotive power, like an original sensation would have, like an original impression would have. So even our return passes through the belief and aspect of force. So emotive force is the first aspect of belief. 2 is imagination. Imagination is informed by belief when it constructs the system of the singular ideas into a complex of ideas. 3, this supplies vigor. The return to the unconscious creates the unconscious body state, the disposition of a body state, and that will inform the construction of the system model by providing the vigor of conception. That's motivation, but Hume calls it the vigor of conception. So reason will compile the system using 3 methodologies. Knowledge, which is the methodology of associating the terms. Proof, which is relating the singular ideas through the logic of causality. He's big on the logic of causality. And then 3, he says we never can get a final model because there's always the off chance of the additional influence of contingency. Contingency is always a possibility. That's the antithesis of causality. Contingency will qualify our model. That's why it never reaches perfection. Therefore, the inertia of the entire process throws us back through belief and force, and then from there back into that counterblow that is going to do what? It's going to inform that second block of the reflection of impressions on the unconscious side. So the system is like we've discovered, it's very much the system that postmodern thought uses, but I like the idea that he really does even bring up the counter blow and that lingering presence in the unconscious. He assumes the system has already run once, but it is a dialectic between impressions in the unconscious and ideas in consciousness, moving from the simplicity of a lexical